Good evening. Tonight we examine something fragrant, seductive, and older than any empire you have ever read about. A leaf, dried, rolled, and lit by firelight long before anyone thought to put a price on it. Somewhere in the world right now, a doctor is reviewing a patient's lung scan. The image is familiar enough to have a name, a prognosis, a well-worn conversation. And if you could travel back, not far, just 70 or 80 years, you would find a different kind of doctor. One in a white coat, posed in a magazine advertisement, holding a cigarette with quiet authority. The caption might read, "More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette." Or perhaps, 20,679 physicians say Luckies are less irritating to sensitive throats. These were not fringe publications. They ran in Time magazine, in Ladies' Home Journal, in the pages of the Journal of the American Medical Association. The people who were supposed to protect us were, for decades, the face of the thing that was killing us. Tonight we trace how that happened. From a sacred plant used in ceremony and prayer, to a commodity that built colonial empires on the backs of enslaved people, to a mass-produced product marketed with breathtaking ingenuity and defended with breathtaking dishonesty. This is the history of tobacco. Set your phone face down, let the room grow still, and let us begin at the very beginning. There is a site in Utah, a dry open expanse of the Great Salt Lake Desert, where archaeologists found something extraordinary. Buried in the ash of an ancient hearth, in a layer of sediment dating back roughly 12,300 years, were 4 small charred seeds of Nicotiana attenuata, desert tobacco, the earliest direct evidence of human beings using the tobacco plant anywhere on Earth. Think about what that means. 12,300 years ago, before the pyramids, before written language, before the wheel, people in the Americas had already found this plant, had already brought it to their fires, had already, in some form we can only imagine, begun to understand what it did. By 8,000 years before the present, the relationship had deepened. Archaeological evidence across the Americas shows something that was not just foraging or casual use. The seeds had changed. The leaves had changed. People were actively cultivating tobacco, selecting for certain characteristics, breeding it across generations with the patience and intentionality of someone who understands that what they are growing matters. The plant was becoming domesticated, and it was becoming sacred. Among the indigenous peoples of North America, tobacco occupied a place in the spiritual life of a community that has no easy equivalent in the modern world. It was not recreational. It was not habitual. It was ceremonial, used sparingly, carefully, in specific contexts that carried enormous weight. For the Ojibwe people, tobacco was called asema. It was an offering. You placed it at the base of a tree from which you gathered medicine. You offered a pinch to the water before beginning a day of wild rice harvest. Before setting out on a canoe journey, you left tobacco on the surface of the water. A quiet request for safe return. When you encountered something powerful in the landscape, a waterfall, an unusually formed tree, a place where the world seemed to breathe differently, you paused and gave tobacco. Among the Cree, tobacco was offered to the Creator with prayers. In sweat lodges and pipe ceremonies, the smoke was understood as carrying intention upward, a vehicle for communication between the human world and something beyond it. When you asked an elder a question of spiritual importance, you brought tobacco first, not as payment, as respect. For many tribes in eastern North America, the pipe itself carried immense significance, sometimes more than the tobacco within it. The calumet, the long ceremonial pipe, was presented during moments of profound consequence, the sealing of treaties, the end of conflict, the beginning of important negotiations. A 16th century Jesuit priest traveling the Mississippi River in 1673, Father Jacques Marquette, observed that the peace pipe was shown universal respect even among peoples at war with one another. He recorded that presenting the pipe during battle could actually halt the fighting. He was gifted one himself by the Illinois people to assure his safe passage through the interior of the continent. The Mayan civilization had developed sophisticated tobacco practices even earlier. By approximately 470 CE, Mayan priests were incorporating tobacco systematically into religious ceremony, offering it as incense on altars, exhaling smoke as a form of prayer. Temple reliefs at Palenque depict priests smoking tobacco wrapped in bark or leaves in forms that look surprisingly like early cigarettes. These practices spread northward as Mayan migrations reached the Mississippi Valley over the following centuries, carrying complex systems of religious and political meaning alongside the plant itself. The tobacco used in these ceremonies was not the tobacco of industry. It was Nicotiana rustica, the older native species. It was not inhaled in the way we now understand smoking. It was not addictive in the way the commercial product would become. Many tribes did not inhale at all during ceremony. The plant was an intermediary, not a habit. It was offered to the world, not consumed by it. This is worth remembering, because in not very many pages of this story, the same plant will look almost unrecognizable. On the morning of October 12th, 1492, a man named Rodrigo de Jerez stepped onto the shores of the island the Taino Arawak people called Guanahani, alongside Christopher Columbus and the crew of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The Taino came to greet them with gifts, fruit, food, spears, and dried leaves they clearly regarded as precious. Columbus accepted the fruit. He looked at the dried leaves, and finding them unrecognizable and odd-smelling, set them aside. Later accounts suggest he simply discarded them. The Taino word for the rolled leaves, or the tubes through which they smoked, was tobacco, a word that, through layers of Spanish mistranslation and European adoption, would eventually become the name by which the plant was known across the entire world. But on that morning in October, Columbus had no frame of reference. He saw leaves. He moved on. It was Rodrigo de Jerez who understood something was happening. Exploring Cuba approximately a month later, he and a companion encountered indigenous people in the act of doing something that had no equivalent in European experience. They were, as one early account describes it, drinking smoke. The concept of smoking did not yet exist in any European language. De Jerez watched. He tried it himself. He became, by all available evidence, the first documented non-American to take up the habit. He would later return to Spain smoking a pipe. His neighbors, witnessing smoke emerging from a man's mouth and nostrils, were so convinced they had seen something diabolical that they'd reported him to the Spanish Inquisition. He was imprisoned for several years. By the time he was released, tobacco had spread across much of Europe. The world, as is its way, had moved on without him. The speed of tobacco's adoption in Europe was remarkable. Within decades of Columbus's first voyage, the plant had crossed the Atlantic, passed through the hands of Portuguese traders, entered French court life, and was being seriously discussed in European medical literature as one of the more promising therapeutic discoveries of the age. The man most credited with bringing tobacco to France was Jean-Nicot de Villemain, a French diplomat who arrived in Lisbon in 1559 as ambassador to Portugal. He was 30 years old, methodical, intellectually curious, and deeply interested in the medical possibilities of the New World plants he encountered in Portuguese gardens and markets. In Lisbon, he learned of tobacco through a Portuguese humanist scholar and began experimenting with its applications on whoever was willing. One account holds that he wrapped fresh tobacco leaves around a wound his chef had sustained. The wound healed. He applied a tobacco ointment to a man on the street with a facial tumor. The tumor appeared to shrink. Whether these were genuine cures or the ordinary course of healing dressed in coincidence is impossible to say now. What matters is what Nicot believed and what he then communicated. In 1560, he dispatched tobacco seeds and dried leaves to Paris, addressed to the Queen Mother of France, Catherine de' Medici. He included careful instructions. She was known to suffer from severe, recurring headaches. He suggested she take the dried leaves, crush them to a fine powder, and inhale them. Through the nose. She did. Her headaches improved, or at least she believed they did, which in medicine is frequently half the battle. The plant acquired an immediate royal patron. It was given a name that reflected its new prestige, Herbe de la Reine, the Queen's herb. French cultivation began almost at once. By 1570, European botanists had formalized the plant's scientific designation in honor of the man who brought it to court. They called the genus Nicotiana. His name, Jean Nicot, is still embedded in the word nicotine, the chemical that would eventually be described by the tobacco industry's own internal scientists as the reason people could not stop. The Queen's herb spread rapidly through European aristocratic culture. Snuff, tobacco ground into powder and inhaled sharply through the nostril, became fashionable in French court circles, then in courts across the continent. It was associated with refinement, with the pleasures of the educated class. The Swiss physician Conrad Gessner, writing in 1563, noted that tobacco produced something he could only describe as a kind of peaceful drunkenness. European physicians who would have recognized this phrase for what it was, a description of intoxication, instead focused on the word peaceful and began publishing treatises. By 1571, medical literature was declaring tobacco a treatment for toothache, headache, respiratory complaints, cancer, and plague. This was not fringe quackery. These were respected practitioners applying the medical logic of their era to a genuinely novel and psychoactive substance, in a context where almost nothing was properly understood about addiction, about nicotine, or about the mechanics of lung tissue. They were wrong, but they were not foolish. They were just working with what they had. What is worth noting, and what would echo in darker form centuries later, is how quickly the framing of tobacco shifted from interesting plant from the Americas to substance endorsed by authority figures. The Queen used it, the doctors recommended it, the botanists named it, the court adopted it. The machinery of credibility was already in place, already working, long before the cigarette had been invented. There was at least one famous dissenting voice in these early years. King James I of England, who reigned from 1603, despised tobacco with a vigor that was almost personal. In 1604, he published a remarkable document called A Counterblast to Tobacco, one of the first explicitly anti-tobacco writings by a head of state. His language was vivid, even by modern standards. He described smoking as a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. He called it a habit learned from barbarous and beastly men, meaning the indigenous peoples of the Americas, a framing that reveals far more about his own prejudices than about the plant. He found the sight of men blowing smoke offensive. He found the smell repellent. He found the whole ritual degrading. His objections were not without some intuitive basis. He was not entirely wrong that the lungs might be involved, but his arguments were largely moral and aesthetic rather than medical, and they did not succeed. More telling is what happened alongside his published condemnation. In the same years that James was writing against tobacco, he was also levying increasingly heavy taxes on its importation and sale. By 1614, Virginia tobacco had become one of the most significant revenue sources in the English Crown's colonial enterprise. The king, who called tobacco dangerous, was also, very quietly, growing dependent on its profits. It is a pattern that will appear again in this story: the simultaneous condemnation of tobacco and dependence upon it, the knowledge of its harm and the unwillingness to act on that knowledge. James I arrived at this contradiction in 1604, mostly by instinct. The tobacco industry would arrive there centuries later by careful calculation. In the meantime, the plant that the Ojibwe had offered to the Creator was sailing across the Atlantic in the holds of merchant ships. It was being packaged and priced and taxed, and a man named John Rolfe was beginning to wonder whether the thin soil of Virginia might, with the right seeds, produce something that could save a failing colony. The sacred had become a commodity. The ceremony had become a trade. And what came next would be built on that transformation, wider, harder, and darker than anything that had come before. If this kind of slow, careful history helps you unwind at the end of a long day, we would be glad to have you stay. Take a moment, if you like this video and subscribe, only if it genuinely serves you. And leave a comment telling us where in the world you are listening from and what hour it is there. These conversations, scattered across time zones and quiet rooms, are something I think about, phone face down. Let us continue. The winter of 1609 to 1610 is remembered in the history of the Jamestown colony as the starving time. Of the roughly 300 settlers who entered the fort that autumn, only 60 survived to see the spring. They ate horses, they ate rats, they ate shoe leather. Archaeological evidence, examined much later, confirmed what the most desperate historical accounts had always suggested: that some ate each other. The colony had been established in 1607 with considerable ambition and almost no practical preparation. It was populated largely by English gentlemen who considered manual labor beneath them, supplemented by craftsmen who found themselves entirely without resources. They had tried glassmaking and failed. They had tried silk production and failed. They had sent back to England samples of sassafras, pitch, lumber. None of it enough to justify the cost of the enterprise. The Virginia Company, which had financed the expedition, was growing impatient, and the land, though fertile, had not yet yielded the thing that would make everything else irrelevant. Into this failing colony, in the spring of 1610, arrived a man named John Rolfe. He was 25 years old, recently widowed. His wife had died during the voyage, as had their infant daughter, and described by contemporaries as an ardent smoker. He had survived a shipwreck in Bermuda, where his vessel had been stranded for nearly 10 months after a massive hurricane scattered the fleet. When he finally reached Jamestown, he found 60 survivors and a settlement on the edge of dissolution. He also found tobacco. The Powhatan people grew it, as indigenous communities throughout Virginia had done for centuries. But the native Virginia species, Nicotiana rustica, was dark and harsh on the European palate. English settlers who tried it found it bitter, almost acrid. It did not compare favorably with the tobacco arriving from Spanish colonial territories in South America and the Caribbean, which had established itself as the preferred product among European smokers. Rolfe had a plan. At some point during his prolonged stay in Bermuda, or through contacts in the Caribbean, Rolfe had obtained seeds of Nicotiana tabacum, the Spanish variety. This was, by the standards of the era, an act of considerable daring. Spain had declared a penalty of death for anyone who sold tobacco seeds to a non-Spaniard. The Spanish crown understood perfectly well what it possessed. Tobacco was one of the most profitable commodities in the Atlantic world, and Spain intended to maintain that monopoly. Rolfe obtained the seeds anyway. How exactly he managed this is a detail history has not preserved. In 1612, working on a plantation he called Varina Farms along the James River, he planted them. Ralph Hamor, the Secretary of Virginia, later recorded that Rolfe gave samples of his harvest to friends to try, and that they agreed the new leaf smoked pleasant, sweet, and strong. The remainder of the crop was shipped to England, where it compared favorably with Spanish tobacco. In 1614, the first 4 barrels of Virginia-grown Nicotiana tabacum crossed the Atlantic. By 1617, 20,000 pounds had arrived in England. By 1627, 500,000 pounds a year were being shipped. By 1630, the figure had exceeded £1.5 million annually. The colony that had been eating shoe leather in 1610 was, 20 years later, the economic engine of English colonial ambition in the New World. Jamestown had found its commodity, and the commodity had found its colony. Tobacco's dominance in Virginia was, by any measure, total. Settlers planted it in the streets. They grew it in cemeteries. Governor Dale, attempting to prevent the colony from abandoning all other agriculture in pursuit of the lucrative leaf, had to issue orders restricting how much tobacco an individual settler could plant. The orders were largely ignored. The plant became currency. Virginia taxes were paid in pounds of tobacco. Court fines were assessed in tobacco. Anglican clergy were paid, by law, 16,000 pounds of tobacco annually. When gold and silver were scarce in the colonies, which was often, tobacco notes served as a medium of exchange recognized by the colonial government and backed by a formal conversion rate. But tobacco demanded something that currency alone could not provide. It demanded labor, enormous quantities of it. The crop is extraordinarily labor-intensive. Seeds must be planted in seed beds, then transplanted individually by hand. The plants must be inspected almost daily. Insects removed by hand from every leaf. The suckers, which grow between stem and branch and drain energy from the plant, must be pinched off. The leaves must be harvested in sequence as they ripen, hung, cured, stripped, and packed into large wooden barrels called hogsheads. and tobacco exhausted the soil within 3 or 4 growing seasons, requiring constant expansion into new land. The solution to the labor problem arrived in stages, each more consequential than the last. At first, the Chesapeake tobacco economy ran on indentured servants, men and women from England who agreed to work for a master for 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage across the Atlantic and the promise of land upon completion of service. The Virginia Company recruited them aggressively, posting notices throughout English port cities. Signs appeared promising opportunity, land, a new life. Many came. The work was brutal. The climate was unlike anything they had experienced in England. Hot, humid, prone to malaria. The mortality rate among new arrivals in the early decades was staggering. Of the approximately 15,000 people who came to Virginia between 1607 and 1625, fewer than 1,200 survived. Those who did survive their indenture and claimed their promised land often found themselves competing against established planters who controlled the best acreage. Some succeeded, many did not, and the supply of willing indentured servants was not infinite. As the tobacco economy expanded, as the planters grew wealthier, and their demand for labor grew accordingly, it became clear that the system of indenture could not scale to meet what was being asked of it. In 1619, a Dutch ship arrived at Jamestown, carrying what early records describe, with deliberate vagueness, as 20-odd Africans. They were likely captives taken from a Portuguese slave ship, intercepted in the Atlantic. The exact legal status of these first arrivals is genuinely unclear. Some historians believe they were treated initially as indentured servants, occupying a legal position similar to white arrivals. A few are known to have eventually obtained their freedom and even land. What followed was not immediate or neat. It was a gradual, decades-long legal and economic architecture, constructed piece by piece through legislation and precedent and the cold logic of profit. By the 1660s, Virginia law had codified hereditary chattel slavery. The principle that the children of enslaved mothers were born enslaved regardless of the status of their fathers. Between 1675 and 1695, 3,000 black people were brought into the Chesapeake region in bondage. By 1700, most plantations had more enslaved workers than indentured servants. By the mid-18th century, enslaved African labor was the foundation upon which the entire Virginia tobacco economy rested. It is not possible to tell the history of tobacco honestly and treat this as a footnote. The tobacco that was being shipped across the Atlantic, the tobacco being enjoyed in English drawing rooms and French parlors, the tobacco that was making certain Virginia families extraordinarily wealthy, was being grown, harvested, and processed by people who had been kidnapped from their homes, stripped of their names, and held in conditions of violent subjugation. The refinement of the product and the brutality of its production existed in the same breath. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that all men are created equal, owned tobacco plantations. He died in debt, partly because the tobacco economy, for all its wealth, was structurally designed to benefit British merchants who extended credit at one end and collected repayment at the other. George Washington planted tobacco at Mount Vernon. James Madison, George Mason, the men who designed the philosophical architecture of American freedom were, many of them, entangled in the economics of tobacco and the labor system that sustained it. The leaf that had once been offered to the Creator as a prayer was now being grown on land taken from indigenous people, by enslaved people taken from Africa, for consumption by Europeans who regarded both as inferior. It is a distance that is difficult to calculate. King James I had seen something, even if he could not quite articulate it correctly. His counterblast to tobacco remained a curiosity, a royal screed against a habit that his own treasury was simultaneously profiting from. He condemned it in 1604 and taxed it heavily in the same years. It is one of the earlier recorded examples of a government simultaneously acknowledging the problematic nature of tobacco and finding itself unwilling or unable to act against it, because the revenue was too valuable. By the time his words were published, Virginia tobacco was already becoming the economic engine that would define colonial America's relationship with Britain for the next century and a half. The English crown needed the revenue. The planters needed the market. The merchants who moved tobacco across the Atlantic needed both. And at the bottom of this structure, unnamed in almost every contemporary account of its prosperity, were the people whose labor made it possible. There is a particular kind of silence in historical records, the silence around the people who do the work while others record the profits, the hogsheads of tobacco rolling down to the James River docks, the ships loading in the August heat, the numbers in the ledgers going up. The names of the enslaved people who made it happen, in most cases, are simply absent. The colony became a commonwealth. The commonwealth became a state. The state became the most populous and wealthy of the 13 colonies that would, in 1776, declare their independence from the very British merchant system that tobacco had helped enrich. The irony is so large, it is almost invisible. And in the meantime, the plant itself kept growing, kept being harvested, kept crossing the ocean, kept entering lungs, the lungs of people who enjoyed it, the lungs of people who had no choice in the matter, the lungs that would one day, centuries later, appear on scans in the offices of doctors who could finally explain what was happening inside them. The leaf had not changed, only the hands holding it had. The tobacco economy was also, from its earliest decades, ecologically destructive in ways that shaped the geography of colonial America. Tobacco exhausted soil completely after 3 or 4 growing seasons. Once the land was spent, it had to be left fallow for years while new ground was cleared. This meant that tobacco cultivation was in constant forward motion, always consuming new land, always pushing the boundary of settlement outward. The consequences for the indigenous peoples of the Chesapeake region were direct and irreversible. As tobacco planters needed fresh soil, they needed fresh land. They took it through purchase agreements that were rarely equitable, through treaty terms that were frequently violated, through the simple pressure of an expanding colonial population that required land and would have it. The territory of the Powhatan Confederacy, the Pamunkey, the Nanticoke, and dozens of other peoples was absorbed into the tobacco economy. The crop that had been sacred to many of these communities was now the instrument of their displacement. And the displacement was not only geographic, it was cultural, spiritual, and linguistic. Whole ways of knowing the tobacco plant, the prayers that accompanied its planting, the ceremonies that governed its use, the distinction between what was offered to the world and what was consumed by it. All of this was eroded, and in many cases, simply lost. The Nicotiana rustica that indigenous peoples had cultivated in balance with their understanding of the land was gradually replaced by the Spanish Nicotiana tabacum that the colonial economy preferred. The sacred was not merely commercialized, it was overwritten. There is a particular grief in that kind of loss that does not always make its way into the formal histories. The tobacco that arrived in European hands had already been something else entirely for 10,000 years. What it became in those hands was, in some respects, the negation of what it had been. By the close of the 18th century, tobacco's hold on the colonial and then the American economy was so established that its future seemed simply to be a continuation of its past. It would be grown, it would be sold, it would be smoked in pipes, chewed, taken as snuff. The forms it had taken for 300 years in the European and American world seemed settled. There were, by this point, regions of the American South where tobacco was not merely an economic crop, but the organizing principle of entire communities. The rhythm of the planting year, the architecture of the plantation house, the debt structures that bound planters to British merchants, the legal systems that maintained the labor force. Tobacco was not simply what people grew. It was, in some regions, the medium through which social reality was organized and understood, and it had spread far beyond Virginia. Maryland tobacco, grown in the tidewater region of the Chesapeake Bay, was competitive with Virginia's finest. North Carolina's flue-cured bright leaf, developed in the 19th century, would eventually become the dominant style for cigarette tobacco in the world. The geography of tobacco production expanded southward and westward as the soil gave out and new land was cleared. The enslaved labor force that made this possible grew accordingly. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, there were approximately 4 million enslaved people in the United States, the majority of them in the tobacco and cotton belt of the South. Their lives and labor built the wealth that funded the universities, the banks, the great houses, the merchant firms. Their names mostly do not appear in the histories of those institutions. What no one yet knew, what no one could quite imagine from within the rhythms of that world, was that a young man in rural Virginia was about to leave college to build a machine, and that this machine would transform tobacco from a colonial commodity into something closer to a conquest of the human nervous system itself. It would put a cigarette within reach of every person on earth. It would reduce the price of a single smoke to a few cents. And the age of mass addiction, quiet, ubiquitous, and very soon very profitable, was about to begin. In 1875, a tobacco company in Richmond, Virginia, made an announcement that was equal parts practical and visionary. Allen and Ginter, one of the most established firms in the American tobacco trade, declared that they would award a prize of $75,000, roughly equivalent to $2 million today, to anyone who could invent a practical machine for rolling cigarettes. The cigarette was not new. It had existed in various forms for centuries. The Mayan priests at Palenque had smoked tobacco wrapped in bark or leaves, and Spanish soldiers returning from the Americas in the 16th century had adopted the habit of rolling tobacco in paper. By the mid-19th century, cigarettes were being made in small factories in Europe, and gradually in New York City. They were a product with a clear market. They were also, by the standards of industrial production, impossibly slow to manufacture. The problem was simple and unyielding. Rolling a cigarette by hand requires a particular kind of dexterity. The paper must be held at the correct tension, the tobacco distributed evenly, the tubes sealed without tearing. A skilled cigarette roller, working at the pace of genuine expertise, could produce approximately 4 cigarettes per minute. working a full day, perhaps 3,000 cigarettes total. This made cigarettes a luxury item, affordable to the refined classes, but not to the laboring ones. And it meant that no matter how large a factory you built or how many workers you employed, the total output remained constrained by the limits of human hands. Allen and Ginter believed a machine could solve this. Most of their competitors were skeptical. The precision required seemed beyond the mechanical capability of the era. Several attempts had been made and abandoned. The prize had gone unclaimed for years. Then James Albert Bonsack decided to try. He was 18 years old when he conceived the idea. The son of a Virginia textile mill owner, he had grown up around industrial machinery and understood, at an intuitive level, how mechanical motion could be translated into production. He enrolled briefly at Roanoke College and then withdrew. The machine was more compelling than the curriculum. He borrowed initial capital from friends and $50 from his grandmother. He set up a workshop in his father's mill, powered by a water-driven shaft, and spent years on the problem. The design he eventually arrived at was elegant in principle. Tobacco was fed onto a continuous strip of paper. A spiral-grooved tube formed the paper around the tobacco into a cylinder. Paste was applied automatically. A rotary cutting knife divided the continuous cylinder into individual cigarettes of uniform length. The whole process moved continuously, one operation feeding into the next, requiring only that a person keep the tobacco and paper supplied at one end and remove finished cigarettes at the other. He filed his patent application in September 1880. The patent was granted in March 1881. His machine, when working properly, could produce 120,000 cigarettes in a 10-hour working day. One machine, 120,000 cigarettes per day. A skilled human roller in the same 10 hours might produce 1,500, perhaps 2,000 on a very good day. The Bonsack machine was, by a rough calculation, 40 to 80 times faster than the best human hand in the world. Allen and Ginter, the company that had offered the prize, tested the machine and rejected it. The official reason was unreliability. The machine broke down frequently and required constant adjustment. The less official reason, suggested by some historians, is that they were reluctant to pay the prize money and uncertain whether consumers would accept machine-made cigarettes. They had asked for a machine, and when they received one, they did not entirely know what to do with it. James Buchanan. Duke knew exactly what to do with it. Duke was 27 years old in 1884 when he made the decision that would define his career and reshape an industry. His family's company, W. Duke, Sons and Company of Durham, North Carolina, was a significant operation but not dominant. The tobacco market was fiercely competitive. Established brands like Bull Durham commanded loyalty that the Duke family had not yet managed to build for their cigarette products. Duke had tried everything the conventional marketing wisdom of the era offered. He had hired skilled Jewish immigrant hand rollers from New York, men who had learned their trade in the courts of European nobility and could produce cigarettes of remarkable quality. He had invested in advertising. He had introduced collectible cards in his cigarette packages, small illustrated images of athletes, actresses, historical moments that customers kept and traded, which meant they had to keep buying cigarettes to complete their sets. He had sponsored unusual promotional events, including a polo team that played on roller skates. None of it was enough. Bull Durham still dominated. Then he heard about Bonsack's machine. In the spring of 1884, Duke installed 2 Bonsack machines in his Durham factory. The machines broke down repeatedly. He hired one of Bonsack's own mechanics, a man named William O'Brien, to live on site and keep them running. Gradually, through a combination of mechanical ingenuity and sheer persistence, they made the machines work. And then Duke did something that would give him an advantage his competitors could not overcome for years. He negotiated a secret contract with the Bonsack Machine Company. Under its terms, Duke would use Bonsack machines exclusively, committing to produce all his cigarettes by machine. And in return, the Bonsack Company would lease machines to Duke at a rate 25% below what they charged anyone else. The contract was confidential. Duke's competitors did not know the terms. They did not know why. When they eventually adopted the same technology, their costs remained stubbornly higher than his. By 1888, Duke had laid off every one of his hand rollers. The machines had replaced them entirely. By 1889, his company was producing 45% of all cigarettes sold in the United States. In 1890, he gathered his major competitors and proposed consolidation. The American Tobacco Company was formed, one of the first great holding companies in American industrial history. It controlled, at its peak, approximately 90% of the domestic cigarette market. The price of a pack of cigarettes, driven down by machine production and economies of scale, fell within reach of almost anyone with a few coins. The cigarette, which had been a luxury of the refined classes, became a democratic product. It became, in time, something even more pervasive than that. Duke's marketing instincts were, by the standards of his era, revolutionary. He understood something that would be confirmed repeatedly over the next century, that when a product becomes cheap enough to be purchased impulsively, the war for market share is won entirely by the image the product carries. He moved the company's executive offices to New York City, where he studied the operations of retail shops and planned his distribution accordingly. He gave cigarettes away free to new immigrants, reasoning correctly that once the habit formed, they would return as paying customers. He plastered advertisements on billboards and building walls. He took out full-page ads in newspapers and magazines. He sponsored events. He kept innovating. His competitors, observing his success, adopted similar methods. The advertising budgets of the major tobacco companies in the first decades of the 20th century were unlike anything American commerce had seen before. More money was spent promoting cigarettes than had ever been spent promoting any previous consumer product. The cigarette was branded, named, given an identity, given a mood. Lucky Strike was toasted, giving it a particular smoothness. Camels were exotic and traveled the world. Chesterfields were simply satisfying. Each cigarette was not merely a product but a personality, and those personalities were constructed with extraordinary care. Then the world went to war. The First World War was, for the tobacco industry, a period of transformation so profound that its effects lasted for decades. Before 1914, cigarette smoking was still seen in some quarters as somewhat effete, a European affectation, less manly than a pipe or a cigar. The war changed that perception entirely. American military commanders and civilian leaders came to see cigarettes as essential to troop morale. General John Pershing, commanding American forces in Europe, reportedly stated that tobacco was as important to his soldiers as food. Cigarettes were included in military rations. They were given to wounded soldiers in field hospitals. Private organizations, the Red Cross, the YMCA, the Salvation Army, ran campaigns to collect and send cigarettes to the front. Editorials described the act of sending tobacco to American soldiers as patriotism made tangible. Young men who might never have smoked under ordinary circumstances developed the habit in the trenches, in the training camps, in the exhausted hours between engagements, when a cigarette was the only available comfort. They came home with the habit fully formed, and it was a habit that, once established, proved remarkably resistant to abandonment. The neurochemistry of nicotine, which no one had yet described in those terms, ensured that the morning cigarette and the post-meal cigarette and the cigarette taken under stress would feel, to the person who needed them, like genuine requirements rather than optional pleasures. The Second World War repeated the pattern, only more so. American tobacco companies donated millions of cigarettes to the armed forces. Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, American Tobacco. They sent cigarettes to the front as a form of patriotic contribution, and simultaneously, one of the most effective long-term marketing campaigns in commercial history. And so, entire generation of young men and women, shaped by the shared experience of global conflict, returned from the war as smokers. In the years that followed, the late 1940s and 1950s, cigarette smoking reached the height of its cultural prestige. Hollywood had embraced it completely. The films of that era are populated by characters who smoke in moments of crisis and celebration alike, who use the lighting of a cigarette to punctuate a dramatic line, who carry cigarettes the way contemporary characters carry phones, as an extension of identity and a prop for emotion. Humphrey Bogart, Lauren Bacall, Bette Davis, Cary Grant, the most elegant people in the most glamorous art form of the age, all smoking. Advertising followed this cultural current and amplified it. The cigarette was associated with sophistication, with independence, with the easy confidence of someone who had their life arranged as they preferred. Women were targeted with imagery connecting cigarettes to slenderness and modern liberation. Men were connected to outdoor strength and professional authority. Young people saw cigarettes in the hands of everyone they admired. Per capita, cigarette consumption among American adults aged 15 and over rose from 747 cigarettes per year in 1920 to 1,828 by 1940. By 1960, it had reached 3,908. In 1963, it peaked at 4,345 cigarettes per American adult per year. Pause with that number for a moment. 4,345 cigarettes in a single year per person. Nearly 12 cigarettes every day for every American adult, whether they smoked or not, averaged across the entire population. Among actual smokers, the numbers were considerably higher. In 1964, at the very apex of this culture, 42% of American adults were daily cigarette smokers. The machine that an 18-year-old from rural Virginia had built in his father's mill had, in 80 years, produced this. What is interesting, and somewhat disquieting from the vantage of later knowledge, is how completely legitimate this world appeared from within. The advertising was pervasive, but not obviously sinister. The associations with glamour and sophistication were not manufactured cynically from nothing. They were built on genuine cultural currents that the industry identified and accelerated. Smoking was fashionable because fashionable people smoked. and fashionable people smoked partly because they were persuaded to, and they were persuaded to because the industry spent enormous sums persuading them. The circularity was invisible from inside the circle. And the doctors were a particular kind of reassurance that would, in retrospect, require a particular kind of reckoning. For decades, beginning in the late 1920s and continuing through the early 1950s, cigarette advertisements featured physicians, not fictional ones, or rather, fictional ones made to look as real as possible. Actors in white coats, confident men with medical authority radiating from their posture, lung specialists and throat doctors who had examined the evidence and found unanimously that their preferred brand was the mildest, the least irritating, the most agreeable to sensitive tissue. Lucky Strike announced in the late 1920s that 11,105 physicians endorsed their cigarettes as less irritating to tender throats. The number later grew in subsequent advertisements to 20,679 physicians. These surveys had been conducted by mailing doctors free cartons of cigarettes, and then asking whether Lucky Strikes were less irritating. The methodology was not subjected to peer review. The culture that had begun with Jean Nicot presenting tobacco to Catherine de Medici as a cure for headaches, the culture of tobacco as medicine, tobacco endorsed by authority, had not disappeared. It had been industrialized. It had been put in the pages of national magazines. It had been given a specific number, 20,679, a number precise enough to feel like science, a number large enough to settle the question for anyone who might have been wondering. And all the while, in laboratories that were not being advertised, in journals that most people did not read, something was beginning to happen. Numbers of a different kind were accumulating, the kind that no advertising campaign could manufacture, the kind that arrived in the form of pathology reports and case studies, and the slow, uncomfortable convergence of evidence that doctors and scientists try to resist as long as possible before finally accepting that the pattern is real. In the 1920s, lung cancer had been rare enough to be considered a medical curiosity. By 1950, it was the most commonly diagnosed cancer in American men. Something had changed, and someone was beginning to ask, what? There is a particular kind of knowledge that arrives slowly, not with a single discovery or a dramatic moment of revelation, but through the quiet accumulation of cases. A physician here, a pathologist there, a number in a registry that is slightly higher than it was the year before, and then slightly higher again, and then higher still, until the pattern is so obvious that the question is no longer whether something is happening, but why no one said so sooner. In 1900, lung cancer was so rare that most physicians encountered it only a handful of times in an entire career. Some never saw a case at all. It was considered, in the medical literature of the era, a curiosity, a condition worth documenting precisely because it was so unusual. A surgeon who operated on a lung cancer patient in 1900 was likely to write it up as a case report. It was that uncommon. By 1950, it was the most commonly diagnosed cancer in American men. The rise had been so steep, so consistent, and so specifically concentrated in the lungs that it had become impossible to ignore. The question of what was causing it had been present in medical circles since at least the 1920s, when the first statistical whispers began to appear. Correlations, patterns, the early and inconclusive, but persistent suggestion that something in the habits of modern men was involved. Investigators proposed industrial pollution, automobile exhaust, the tarring of roads, the residue of 2 world wars. All of these were examined. None of them fully explained what the numbers were showing. In 1941, 2 surgeons at Charity Hospital in New Orleans, Alton Oxner and Michael DeBakey, published an observation that many of their colleagues found uncomfortable. They had noticed a dramatic increase in the number of lung cancers they were seeing in their operating theaters. They had also noticed something about the patients. Almost all of them were men. Almost all of them smoked. They called attention to the parallel rise in cigarette sales that had followed the industrialization of the 1880s and accelerated through 2 world wars. They were not claiming proof. They were noticing a coincidence too persistent to dismiss. Their colleagues, many of whom smoked themselves, were not ready to accept the implication. In 1950, the evidence ceased to be a whisper. 2 landmark studies were published in the same year on both sides of the Atlantic by scientists who had not coordinated their work and who arrived at the same conclusion independently. In the United States, a medical student named Ernst Winder approached the thoracic surgeon Evarts Graham, a heavy smoker who was personally skeptical of any tobacco connection, with a proposal for a case-control study. Graham gave Winder access to his lung cancer patients. Together, they examined 604 men with confirmed bronchogenic carcinoma and compared them to a control group drawn from the same hospitals. The results were, in the language of Winder and Graham's own paper, unambiguous. 96.5% of the men with lung cancer were moderate to heavy smokers. The rate among the general hospital population without cancer was substantially lower. They published their findings in May 1950 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. In England that same year, the physician Richard Doll and the statistician Austin Bradford Hill published a parallel case control study in the British Medical Journal. They had examined over 1,000 lung cancer patients across 20 London hospitals and compared them to matched controls. Their conclusion aligned precisely with Winder and Graham's. Patients with lung cancer had significantly greater odds of having smoked than those without. Evarts Graham, the thoracic surgeon who had been personally skeptical, who had smoked throughout his career, who had enabled the study partly because he doubted what it would find, read the results, and began trying to quit smoking. He would eventually die of lung cancer in 1957, 7 years after helping to establish the evidence of its cause. Doll and Hill continued their work. In 1951, they launched what became known as the British Doctors Study, a long-term prospective cohort study in which they enrolled tens of thousands of British physicians and followed them for decades, tracking their smoking habits and their health outcomes. The study would run until 2001. Its findings, reported at intervals across half a century, would become one of the most important bodies of evidence in the history of public health. The pattern it revealed was consistent, dose-dependent, and devastating. Smokers died younger, heavier smokers died younger still, and the primary instrument of their death, with remarkable regularity, was their lungs. By 1952, the scientific case linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer was, among researchers who had examined the evidence closely, essentially settled. Not universal, science is never universal, but settled in the way that matters. The weight of evidence was clear. The pattern was consistent across multiple independent studies, and no competing explanation had emerged that could account for what was being observed. The tobacco industry had been watching. On December 14th, 1953, Paul Hahn, the president of the American Tobacco Company, sent invitations to the heads of the other major American tobacco firms. The meeting was held the following day at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. 6 companies were represented. The atmosphere, by the accounts that later emerged from internal documents, was one of genuine alarm. The problem was not merely the scientific studies, it was the coverage. In November 1953, Reader's Digest had published a summary of the emerging research under the title Cancer by the Carton. The article reached millions of ordinary Americans who had never read the Journal of the American Medical Association. It described in accessible language what the scientists were finding. It asked the question that the tobacco executives most feared being asked publicly. What if the cigarette that 42% of American adults smoked every single day was killing them? Sales had already begun to soften. The stock prices of tobacco companies were under pressure. Something had to be done. At the Plaza Hotel, the executives decided that something would be public relations. They hired Hill and Knowlton, one of the most influential public relations firms in the country, led by John W. Hill, who understood immediately that simple denial would not be sufficient. The public trusted science. You could not simply tell the public that science was wrong. What you could do, what Hill proposed, was something more sophisticated. You could tell the public that science was uncertain. You could take a question that researchers had largely answered and reintroduce it as an open controversy. You could fund your own research, recruit your own scientists, and amplify their skepticism until the signal of genuine scientific consensus was lost in the noise of manufactured debate. This was the strategy. It was not devised in ignorance. The men in that room knew or strongly suspected what the evidence showed. The internal documents that would eventually become public, through whistleblowers, through litigation, through the enormous archive released under the 1998 Master Settlement Agreement, confirm that senior scientists and executives at tobacco companies acknowledged in private correspondence and internal memoranda that smoking caused cancer. They accepted this privately, they denied it publicly, and they organized with considerable sophistication to ensure that the public denial could be sustained. On January 4th, 1954, 3 weeks after the Plaza Hotel meeting, a full-page advertisement appeared in 448 newspapers across the United States. It reached, by later estimates, 43 million Americans. It was signed by the heads of the major tobacco companies and presented as a statement of honest concern from an industry that cared about its customers. It was called A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers. The language was measured, reasonable, and carefully constructed to do exactly what Hill and Knowlton had designed it to do. It acknowledged that recent studies had raised questions. It expressed concern for public health. It stated, with the calm authority of men who had examined the evidence and found it wanting, that the companies did not believe their products were injurious to health. It announced the formation of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, a new body that would conduct independent scientific inquiry into the relationship between smoking and disease. It also stated, in plain language, "We believe the products we make are not injurious to health. Internally, they believe no such thing. a Philip Morris vice president had announced in public that if the company had any knowledge that its products harmed consumers, it would stop doing business immediately. Internally, the company's own scientists had been accumulating evidence to the contrary for years. The Tobacco Industry Research Committee, headed by the geneticist Clarence Cook Little, a man with genuine scientific credentials, which was precisely the point, was not designed to find truth. It was designed to produce the appearance of ongoing inquiry. As long as the committee existed and was publishing, the industry could point to it as evidence of good faith. As long as good faith could be invoked, the question of what the industry actually knew could be deferred. Little recruited scientists who were skeptical of the smoking cancer link. He amplified their voices. He published their work. He created, with deliberate craft, the impression that the scientific community had not reached a conclusion, when in fact, outside the tobacco-funded ecosystem, the conclusion had been reached years earlier. The strategy worked for a decade. Through the mid-1950s, per capita cigarette consumption continued to rise. Advertising continued. The doctor campaigns continued. Though they were eventually phased out as the public began to associate the medical framing with the controversy rather than the reassurance. In 1957, Surgeon General Leroy Burney made the first official statement from the U.S. Public Health Service, acknowledging a causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer. The industry responded by pointing to the ongoing work of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. The debate, it insisted, was not settled. In 1962, newly appointed Surgeon General Luther Terry announced that he would convene an expert advisory committee to review the evidence comprehensively. He invited nominations from major health organizations, and in a gesture of procedural fairness that the industry would later use against him, from the Tobacco Institute as well. The committee ultimately selected 10 experts, physicians, statisticians, pharmacologists, none of whom had previously taken a public position on the tobacco question. They met at the National Library of Medicine in Bethesda, Maryland, from November 1962 through January 1964. They reviewed more than 7,000 scientific articles. They applied a framework of causal criteria that was, for its time, remarkably rigorous. And they reached a conclusion. On the morning of January 11th, 1964, a Saturday chosen specifically to minimize the immediate impact on the stock market, Luther Terry stood before a room full of reporters and announced the release of the advisory committee's report. Smoking, he said, causes lung cancer in men. The evidence was sufficient. The causal relationship was established. Further, smoking was identified as the most important cause of chronic bronchitis, with a correlation to emphysema and coronary heart disease. The report estimated that average smokers had a 9 to 10 times greater risk of developing lung cancer than non-smokers. Among heavy smokers, the risk was at least 20 times greater. Terry himself had smoked for years. He had quit before delivering the report. He understood, standing in that room, that what he was about to say would not be welcomed by the 42% of American adults who were daily smokers, or by the industry that had spent a decade and enormous sums of money insisting the question was still open. The room was quiet when he finished. For several days, the report led newspaper front pages across the country and opened television newscasts. It was ranked, at year's end, among the most significant news stories of 1964. The stock market had been warned by the Saturday timing. It fell anyway. And here is where the macro loop that has been running since the beginning of this story closes. The Oshogo question opened in the hook of this documentary was not simply how tobacco became dangerous. It was how a product known to be dangerous sustained itself for decades after that knowledge was clear, and who, specifically, was responsible for that gap. The answer, confirmed by 14 million pages of internal documents eventually made public, is both simple and staggering. The executives knew. Their scientists told them in internal memoranda and private correspondence as early as the late 1940s and certainly by the mid-1950s that their product caused cancer. A Brown and Williamson document written in 1963, the year before the Surgeon General's report, the year the tobacco industry was still publicly maintaining that the science was uncertain, states with unambiguous clarity, nicotine is addictive. We are, then, in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug. They knew what they were selling. They knew what it did. They had known for years. And they had spent those years not investigating the truth, but constructing an apparatus. Public relations firms, industry research committees, carefully recruited scientists, strategically placed doubt, designed to ensure that the public did not know what they knew. The Surgeon General's report did not end the tobacco industry. It did not immediately, even significantly reduce the amount that Americans smoked. The habit was too entrenched, the addiction too powerful, the cultural associations too deep. What it did was establish, permanently and officially, a truth that the industry had been paying to suppress for a decade. The question was no longer whether cigarettes killed people. The question was, what would happen next? That, as it turned out, would take considerably longer to answer than anyone hoped. The Surgeon General's report landed in January 1964 with the weight of something that had been building for a long time. Newspapers ran it on their front pages. Television newscasts led with it. For several days, it was the story. And then, as stories do, it began to share space with other things, with politics and sports and the accumulating texture of daily life. The cigarettes were still in their packs. The habits were still in place. The industry was still operating. What followed was not a swift reckoning. It was something slower and more complicated, a decades-long negotiation between what was now known and what would actually be done about it, between science and commerce, between public health and private profit, between the government's responsibility to protect its citizens and its dependents, financial and political, on an industry that employed hundreds of thousands of people and generated billions of dollars in tax revenue. The first concrete legislative response came in 1965, when Congress required warning labels on cigarette packages. This was a genuine step. It was also, in ways that would become clear only later, a step that the tobacco industry had quietly helped to shape. The federal legislation that required warning labels also, by its very existence, established the principle of federal preemption, meaning that once the federal government had spoken on cigarette advertising and labeling, states were significantly constrained in their ability to impose stronger restrictions at the local level. The industry had spent considerable resources ensuring that the federal response, when it came, was the weakest version that could be made to look like action. This was the tobacco industry's political genius, and it operated consistently across decades. When regulation became inevitable, the industry worked not to prevent it, but to define it. When scientific evidence became undeniable, the industry worked not to dispute the science, but to control the policy response to it. It was a strategy of managed concession, giving up the minimum necessary to forestall the maximum possible. Per capita cigarette consumption did not immediately collapse after 1964. It declined gradually, fitfully, over years. The habit was too deeply embedded in American culture, and nicotine's hold on the nervous system too strong for a government report, however authoritative, to simply dissolve it. Millions of people heard the Surgeon General's conclusion and lit another cigarette, not from stupidity or recklessness, but because the body's chemical dependency does not respond to information the way the mind might wish it to. The industry, observing that its customers were not abandoning cigarettes despite the new official framing, adapted. The era of doctors in advertisements was over. That particular association had become too risky. But the association of cigarettes with desirable identities was not over. It was refined. In 1988, R.J. Reynolds introduced a cartoon character named Joe Camel to promote its Camel cigarette brand. Joe was a confident, stylized dromedary, sunglasses, leather jacket, perpetually relaxed, drawn in a visual language that resonated with popular culture. He appeared on billboards, in magazine advertisements, on merchandise. He was, by the visual logic of advertising, clearly aimed at adults. The industry maintained this position without deviation. Researchers at the University of California examined children's recognition of advertising characters in the late 1980s and early 1990s. They found that among American children between the ages of 3 and 6, the recognition rate for Joe Camel was comparable to the recognition rate for Mickey Mouse. Children who could not yet read could identify Joe Camel and associate him with cigarettes. The industry maintained that this was not targeting, that children would encounter advertising regardless, and that exposure did not constitute intent. The internal documents that became public years later told a different story, one in which youth markets were explicitly discussed as essential to the long-term health of cigarette brands, on the logic that the habits formed before the age of 21 were the habits that lasted a lifetime, and that a smoker who had not started by their early 20s was unlikely to start at all. Joe Camel was retired in 1997 under the terms of a settlement with the Federal Trade Commission. By then, the lawsuits had already begun. In 1994, Michael Moore, the Attorney General of Mississippi, a man who had grown up watching members of his family die of smoking-related illness, filed a lawsuit against the major tobacco companies on behalf of the state of Mississippi. The legal theory was straightforward in its structure, if unprecedented in its ambition. The state had spent enormous sums through its Medicaid program treating the illnesses caused by tobacco. The tobacco companies had caused those illnesses while knowingly concealing the evidence of their product's danger. The state was entitled to recovery. Every other state in the country eventually filed similar suits. As Moore declared at the time, the premise was simple. You caused the health crisis, you pay for it. That same year, 1994, something else happened that would prove equally consequential. On April 14th, the chief executives of the 7 largest American tobacco companies were called to testify before a congressional subcommittee on health and the environment. They arrived in suits. They were sworn in, and one by one, When asked whether they believed nicotine to be addictive, each of them answered no. 7 men, 7 companies, 7 answers that contradicted, directly and under oath, what their own internal scientists had confirmed in writing more than 30 years earlier. The Brown and Williamson memo from 1963. Nicotine is addictive. We're in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug, had not yet been made public. But it existed. It was sitting in a filing cabinet, and it directly contradicted what was being said under oath to the United States Congress. The hearings were broadcast. The images of 7 executives, hands raised, insisting that their product was not addictive, became one of the most enduring visual artifacts of the entire tobacco story. They were watched by millions of Americans. They were also watched from a distance by a man named Jeffrey Wigand. Wigand had been the Vice President of Research and Development at Brown and Williamson, one of the 7 companies whose representative had just testified before Congress. He had left the company in 1993 under circumstances that were tense and legally complicated. He had signed a confidentiality agreement. He had been for a year silent. What Wigand knew, what he had seen from inside the company's research apparatus, was that Brown and Williamson's scientists had documented the addictive properties of nicotine in detail, had explored ways of manipulating nicotine delivery to maximize the hold cigarettes had on their users, and had done so while the company's public representatives were insisting that the science was uncertain and the product was not addictive. In 1995 and 1996, Wigand began speaking to investigators. He spoke to the Food and Drug Administration. He spoke to state attorneys general. He eventually spoke in a deposition that was leaked to the press and then broadcast widely to 60 Minutes. The tobacco industry's response was extensive and expensive. Private investigators were hired. His personal life was examined. His professional history was scrutinized for anything that could be used to discredit him. His confidentiality agreement was invoked in legal proceedings. The campaign against him was documented in detail by the reporters covering the story, and later described in a film that reached audiences far beyond those who had followed the original news coverage. Wigand survived it, the testimony survived it, and the state lawsuits kept moving forward. On November 23, 1998, in what remains the largest civil litigation settlement in American legal history, the attorneys general of 46 states signed an agreement with the 4 largest tobacco companies. The states that had not joined, Florida, Mississippi, Texas, and Minnesota, had already settled separately. The agreement was called the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement. Under its terms, the tobacco companies agreed to pay the states a total that would ultimately exceed $200 billion over 25 years to compensate for Medicaid and public health costs attributable to smoking. They agreed to restrictions on advertising. No more cartoon characters, no more billboard advertising, no more branded merchandise, no more payments for product placement in films and television. They agreed to the dissolution of the Tobacco Institute, the primary lobbying arm of the industry, and the Tobacco Industry Research Committee and its successor organizations, the entities that had been manufacturing doubt since 1954, and they agreed to make their documents public. 14 million pages of internal tobacco company records were eventually deposited into publicly accessible archives. They are searchable today They contain the meeting minutes and research summaries and internal memoranda and strategic planning documents of the most successful and lethal consumer product company in American history. They contain the proof of what was known and when. They are, taken together, one of the most remarkable collections of corporate self-incrimination ever assembled. The settlement was celebrated by public health advocates. It was also almost immediately critiqued. The money was real, but most states were not required to spend it on tobacco prevention or public health. Facing budget shortfalls and other pressures, many states diverted their tobacco settlement funds into general revenues. Anti-smoking programs that could have been funded by the settlement were funded at a fraction of what public health experts recommended. The industry adapted. It always adapted. What happened in the United States after 1964? The slow decline in smoking rates, the warning labels, the advertising restrictions, the lawsuits, the settlement, was the result of decades of sustained effort by public health advocates, researchers, journalists, lawyers, and legislators working against an industry with vastly greater resources and a powerful political presence. The progress was real. By the mid-2000s, the percentage of American adults who smoked had fallen from 42% in 1964 to roughly 18%. Millions of lives were extended. The Surgeon General later estimated that the tobacco control efforts of the preceding decades had prevented approximately 8 million premature deaths in the United States alone. But while the American market was declining, the industry was pivoting. The same companies, the same playbooks, the same strategies of marketing, of regulatory capture, of manufactured doubt, deployed now in countries where the regulatory infrastructure was weaker, where the public health history with tobacco was shorter, where governments were more susceptible to industry pressure and less equipped to resist it. Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Europe, Latin America. The markets that Philip Morris and R.J. Reynolds and British American Tobacco moved into as their American revenues came under pressure, were populated by millions of people who had not lived through the long American education in what cigarettes actually did, who had not seen the congressional hearings, who had not read the Surgeon General's report, and who were, consequently, far more receptive to the familiar seductions, the glamour, the sophistication, the authority figure in the advertisement holding a cigarette with easy confidence. The industry brought its American methodology to these new markets and applied it with the efficiency of long practice. Advertising that had been restricted in the United States appeared on billboards in Jakarta and Nairobi and Warsaw. Sponsorships that could no longer operate in New York operated in Bangkok. The science that had taken decades to accumulate in the United States was not automatically available to populations in countries where the epidemiological infrastructure was less developed and the regulatory history was shorter. Today, the World Health Organization estimates that tobacco kills approximately 8 million people every year. 8 million. That is more than the annual global death toll from HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria combined. Approximately 7 million of those deaths are the result of direct tobacco use. The remaining 1 million are non-smokers killed by exposure to second-hand smoke. The vast majority of tobacco-related deaths now occur in low and middle-income countries. Exactly the markets the industry pivoted toward. As its Western revenues came under pressure, the 14 million internal documents released under the settlement are searchable at the University of California, San Francisco. Anyone can read them. The meetings and the strategies and the calculations and the memoranda are there in the original language, in the handwriting of the men who wrote them. The distance between what they said and what they knew is there, on the page, for anyone who wishes to measure it. The tobacco industry's methods have been studied carefully, and not only by historians. The same fundamental strategy, acknowledge uncertainty, fund your own science, amplify dissenting voices, defer regulation while appearing to cooperate with it, has been identified in the response of the fossil fuel industry to climate science, in the opioid industry's management of addiction evidence, in the food industry's handling of research on sugar and metabolic disease. The playbook that Hill and Knowlton designed in a hotel room in New York in December 1953 has been borrowed and applied and refined across industries for 70 years. The leaf traveling from a Taino Arawak gift to a corporate strategy session had taught commerce something it would not forget. There is a photograph, not a single photograph, but a type of photograph that recurs across decades of American advertising archives. A man or a woman, sometimes in a white coat, sometimes in evening clothes, sometimes in military uniform, holding a cigarette. The expression is always some variation of the same thing. Ease, a particular kind of composed, unhurried ease that the camera has been arranged to capture, and the viewer is invited to absorb. The message underneath the image changes. A brand name, a slogan, a number of physicians surveyed, but the expression never does. What the photograph is selling is not the cigarette. The cigarette is almost incidental. What it is selling is the feeling of being a person who is not worried. A person to whom the important questions have already been answered. A person who has, by some combination of good taste and good luck, arrived at a place of settled confidence where a cigarette can be lifted and drawn from without anxiety, where the world is for this moment entirely manageable. This is what advertising has always sold, not products, but states of being. The cigarette industry understood this earlier and executed it more completely than perhaps any commercial enterprise before or since. And the tragedy embedded in those photographs, visible now from the far side of what we know, is that the ease they depicted was real in the moment of its depiction, and the cigarette in the hand of the person feeling it was, with quiet biochemical patience, arranging to make that ease necessary rather than optional. Nicotine reaches the brain within seconds of inhalation. It binds to receptors that trigger the release of dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with reward and pleasure, producing a brief clean elevation of mood and a sharpening of attention. The brain, being the adaptive organ it is, registers this pattern and begins to anticipate it. It adjusts its baseline accordingly. The receptors that once responded to naturally occurring dopamine become calibrated to the higher levels that nicotine produces. Without the cigarette, the mood does not simply return to its former resting state. It falls below it. The ease that the cigarette once added becomes the ease that only the cigarette can restore. This is addiction, not weakness, not lack of willpower. The architecture of the nervous system, responding to a chemical it was never designed to encounter at those concentrations, in a product that had been engineered over decades of research into precisely the form most effective at producing and maintaining dependence. The Brown and Williamson executive who wrote in 1963 that his company was in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug, was not confessing to something his company had discovered by accident. He was describing the product as it had been understood internally for years. The addiction was not a side effect. It was, in the most precise commercial sense of the word, the feature. Let us return for a moment to the beginning. 12,300 years ago, in the desert of what is now Utah, someone sat beside a fire and used the tobacco plant. We do not know what ceremony accompanied that use or what understanding governed it. We do not know what the plant meant to that person in the language and the world they inhabited. What the archaeology tells us is only that the encounter happened, that the relationship between human beings and this plant is older than any civilization we can name. By the time the Ojibwe were offering asema to the Creator, by the time the Mayan priests were exhaling smoke toward their altars, by the time the Taino Arawak were presenting dried leaves as a gift to visitors they had never seen before. Tobacco had been a companion to human spiritual life for thousands of years. It was not consumed, it was offered. The direction of the relationship was outward, from the person towards something larger than themselves. The smoke rose, the prayer went with it. The word that Jean Nicot did not have when he sent his seeds to Paris in 1560 was addiction. He had no framework for understanding what the plant actually did to the brain, because the brain's chemistry would not be mapped for another 4 centuries. He saw a plant that seemed to relieve headaches, that produced a calm and pleasant sensation that the most refined people of his era were adopting with enthusiasm. He saw medicine, he saw prestige, he sent it to the Queen. What he sent without knowing it was a delivery mechanism for a molecule that would, once industry found the optimal way to concentrate and aerosolize it, prove capable of enslaving the nervous systems of hundreds of millions of people. The Queen's headache improved. The addiction that followed, if it followed for her, was invisible, as it would remain for most people for most of the history that followed. The gap between what tobacco was and what it became is not a chemical gap. Nicotiana tabacum is Nicotiana tabacum, the molecule that caused the Ojibwe to describe their offering as sacred, and the molecule that caused an anonymous Brown and Williamson executive to describe his product as an addictive drug, are, in their basic structure, the same. The distance between the ceremony and the corporation is not in the leaf. It is in the decision to industrialize, to mass produce, to concentrate, to engineer the delivery mechanism for maximum efficiency, to market the resulting product to every human being on earth. And, when the evidence of its harm became undeniable, to fund the appearance of uncertainty rather than accept the responsibility that certainty would require. The knowledge gap, the space between what the tobacco executives knew and what the public was permitted to know, is the part of the story that sits heaviest when you examine it in the quiet hours. Not because it is the only example of such a gap in the history of industry. It is not. Commerce has, since its beginnings, found ways to manage the distance between inconvenient truth and profitable narrative. The tobacco industry was not unique in its willingness to prioritize revenue over candor. What makes it distinctive is the scale, the documentation, and the duration. The scale, 8 million deaths per year, every year now. Not a crisis from a distant era, but a continuing one, happening in the present tense, on every continent, in every country where the industry's products are sold. The cumulative death toll from tobacco in the 20th century alone has been estimated at 100 million people. 100 million. The documentation, 14 million pages. available, searchable. The architects of the Doubt campaign did not imagine, in 1953, that their strategy sessions and internal research reports and private memoranda would one day be read by anyone who wished to read them. They wrote freely in the language of people who believed they were protected by confidentiality and the ordinary opacity of corporate life. What they wrote is now public. The gap between what they said and what they knew is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of record. The duration, from the Plaza Hotel meeting in December 1953 to the Master Settlement Agreement in November 1998, is 45 years. 45 years during which the industry publicly maintained that the science was uncertain, that the causal link was unproven, that more research was needed, while internally its own scientists confirmed again and again that the link was clear, the causation established, the product addictive. 45 years is not a brief miscalculation. It is a policy, and the policy was implemented by specific people, at specific desks, in specific offices, making specific decisions. This is worth holding on to, because there is a tendency, when confronting the scale of something like the tobacco story, to allow it to become abstract, to locate the harm in a system, in a structure, in the inevitable logic of capitalism, in something diffuse and impersonal that was simply larger than any individual's ability to resist. This framing is not entirely wrong. The structures were real, the pressures were real. The logic of quarterly earnings and shareholder expectations and competitive markets created conditions in which individuals found it easier to comply than to refuse. But the individuals also made choices. Paul Hahn chose to call that meeting. John Hill chose to design the Doubt campaign. The scientists who joined the Tobacco Industry Research Committee chose to lend their credentials to the project of manufactured uncertainty. The executives who raised their right hands in 1994 and said under oath that nicotine was not addictive made a choice. They were not compelled. They chose. The person who did not choose, who had no say in the matter, was the young man in Seoul or Nairobi or Sao Paulo who encountered a cigarette advertisement in 1985 on a billboard in a city that had no Surgeon General's report, no warning label legislation, no Weigand, no settlement, who was sold with great professional skill, the ease in the photograph, who developed a habit, who developed a dependence, who, 20 years later, sat in a doctor's office and listened to an explanation of what was visible on his scan. He did not choose any of that, except in the narrow technical sense that he reached for the cigarette. The industry that placed it within his reach at a price he could afford, in a package designed by researchers who understood the neuroscience of brand loyalty, had done its work very well. What does this story ask of us at its end? Not outrage. Outrage has its uses, but it tends to be brief and to leave things as they were. Not despair, which is simply outrage that has given up. What it asks, perhaps, is the particular form of attention that comes from understanding a pattern clearly enough to recognize it when it appears again. The tobacco industry's playbook: manufacture uncertainty, fund competing science, manage the regulatory response, maintain the public posture of concern while privately accepting the truth, has been identified in the climate debate, in the opioid crisis, in decades of food industry research on sugar and addiction. The people who built it are mostly gone. The strategy lives on, copied and adapted with the efficiency of something that has been proven to work. Understanding how it worked in its original form is one of the things we can do. It is not nothing. The 14 million documents exist because researchers and lawyers and journalists refused to let the gap between what was known and what was said remain private. The warning labels exist. The settlement exists. Youth smoking rates in the United States have fallen from 23% in 2000 to 2% in 2022. A genuine, measurable, meaningful reduction that represents millions of young people who did not begin a habit that would have shortened their lives. Progress is real. It is also incomplete, and the cost of the years during which the gap between knowledge and public acknowledgement was maintained, counted in the lives that might have been longer, in the lung scans that might have looked different, in the decades of diminished health that might have been avoided, is not recoverable. It simply is what it is, the record. There is one more thing worth sitting with before we arrive at the end. The Surgeon General's report, released on that Saturday morning in January 1964, was based on more than 7,000 scientific articles. Its advisory committee had spent 14 months reviewing them. The 10 experts who signed their names to its conclusions had no prior public position on tobacco, had been selected precisely for their absence of bias, and had applied a framework of causal reasoning that was, for its era, unusually rigorous and transparent. It represented, in the Bonsack truest sense, the weight of accumulated human knowledge brought to bear on a question of enormous public consequence. And yet the day after it was released, the cigarette companies were still open. The cigarettes were still being manufactured, the advertisements were still running, the stocks fell, and then they recovered. The habit, as we have noted, was too entrenched, the addiction too powerful, the industry too well-resourced, and too politically embedded for a single document, however authoritative, however carefully constructed, to simply undo what decades of industrial effort had built. This is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with. Not the lie itself. The lie, once documented, is at least legible. It has a shape. It has names attached to it. It can be examined and understood, and in some legal and historical sense, held to account. What is harder is the recognition that truth, once established, does not automatically become effective. That knowing a thing and acting on that knowledge are separated by a distance that turns out, in practice, to be considerable. That the gap between what a society understands and what a society does can persist for decades, sustained by the inertia of habit and the momentum of industry and the ordinary human difficulty of changing something that is woven into the texture of daily life. This is not a counsel of despair. It is simply an honest accounting of how change moves, not in the clean, swift arc that the announcement of a truth might suggest, but slowly, through the accumulation of smaller changes, each one insufficient on its own, and yet collectively, over time, capable of shifting something that once seemed immovable. The percentage of American adults who smoke fell from 42% in 1964 to roughly 11% by 2023. That is a profound transformation, achieved over 60 years through warning labels and advertising restrictions and tax increases and public health campaigns, and the quiet accumulation of personal decisions made by millions of people who chose, one by one, to quit or never to start. It was not achieved through a single intervention. It was achieved through the sustained application of everything that was known, imperfectly and incompletely, in the face of an industry that spent those same 60 years finding new ways to preserve its markets. And still, every year, 8 million people die. The arithmetic of that is worth holding. If tobacco control efforts in the United States prevented roughly 8 million premature American deaths over the 60 years since 1964, as some estimates suggest, and if the global death toll from tobacco currently runs at 8 million per year, then the world loses, in a single year, approximately as many people as the United States prevented losing over 6 decades. The scale of what was prevented is real and meaningful. The scale of what was not prevented is larger. Neither of these facts cancels the other. Both of them are true simultaneously, which is the uncomfortable position that honest reckoning tends to produce. We did something. We did not do enough. We are still doing something. It is still not enough. These statements coexist, and the appropriate response to their coexistence is neither celebration nor paralysis, but the ongoing, unglamorous work of continuing. The leaf itself is still growing. In Virginia, tobacco is still cultivated, though on a fraction of the acreage that once defined the economy of the entire region. In North Carolina and Kentucky, in the flu-cured fields of the South, in enormous quantities in Brazil and China and Zimbabwe and India. The plant that humans first encountered around a fire in the Utah desert 12,300 years ago is now one of the most extensively cultivated agricultural commodities on Earth, grown on approximately 4 million hectares of land across more than 120 countries. Nicotiana tabacum does not know any of this. It grows toward the light. It produces its leaves. It contains in those leaves the molecule it has always contained, a natural insecticide in its original biological function that evolved to protect the plant from the insects that would otherwise consume it. The plant was not trying to hook anyone. It was simply doing what plants do. Everything that followed, the ceremony, the empire, the machine, the advertisement, the memo, the settlement, the 8 million deaths per year, was the work of human beings. Their ingenuity and their greed and their capacity for self-deception and their occasional hard-won courage. Their choices made over centuries in the full range of contexts that human beings inhabit: sacred, commercial, scientific, political, personal. The Ojibwe elder who accepted tobacco as a gift for a question of spiritual importance understood something about the plant that the Plaza Hotel meeting forgot entirely. Not that tobacco was harmless, but that it was powerful, and that power required governance. That the relationship between the human being and the substance had to be held within a structure of meaning that prevented the substance from becoming simply a product. That some things, offered without restraint, without ceremony, without the limiting wisdom of a tradition that had learned over generations what they could and could not bear, some things, offered that way, become something else. What they become, the history of tobacco shows us, is a lesson that takes a very long time to learn. A lesson written, in the end, not in any single document or court ruling or public health report, but in the accumulated weight of what it cost. Tonight, somewhere, 8 million people are in the last year of their lives because of tobacco. Most of them are not in the countries that produced the Surgeon General's report. Most of them are in places where the education came late or has not fully arrived. The numbers are not projections. They are not estimates with wide confidence intervals. They are, with the grim precision of epidemiology, the current, ongoing, present tense cost of a decision made in a hotel room in New York City in December 1953, and of every decision made before and after it, across a chain of choices that reaches back, if you follow it far enough, to a riverside plantation in Virginia in 1612, and further back still to a diplomat in Lisbon who sent seeds to a queen. The leaf did not ask to carry any of this. The people who carried it chose to. That is where we leave it tonight. Not with a resolution. The story does not have one, not yet, but with the particular kind of clarity that comes from having traced a thing from its beginning, from having held the full shape of it in mind long enough to understand not just what happened, but why it was allowed to, and what it would have required to stop it sooner, and what it still requires now. The room is quiet. The night is what it is. And somewhere, in a ceremony far older than any of this, someone is offering a pinch of tobacco to the water before setting out on a journey, asking, in whatever language carries that prayer, for a safe return. Good night.